Welcome to another deep exploration of Tamriel's darkest political realities, where we examine the blood-soaked machinery that governed Skyrim's 9 holds. Today's account presents over 100 verified facts about the Nordic Jarl system, the court positions, succession laws, military structures, and brutal justice that defined hold governance during the Fourth Era. You will discover how Jarls wielded absolute power over life and death within their territories, how the Moot system designed to prevent succession crises instead guaranteed civil war, how stewards controlled economic devastation, while court wizards conducted experiments that would horrify their citizens, and how the entire apparatus of Nordic governance revealed itself as organized tyranny concealed behind honor and tradition. Most disturbing, this system persisted for millennia, not because it worked well, but because peace allowed its fundamental contradictions to remain hidden until crisis made them catastrophically visible. And if you genuinely enjoy these factual explorations of Tamriel's dark history, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. The headsman's axe caught the morning light as it fell. Blood spattered across the cobblestones of Solitude's courtyard, and Captain Aldous watched Rogvir's body crumple without ceremony. Another execution completed, another command from Jarl Elisif carried out with brutal efficiency. The gathered crowd dispersed in silence, understanding what they had witnessed, not merely justice, but the absolute authority of a Jarl's word made flesh and bone and severed neck. In the blue palace above, Steward Falk Firebeard reviewed the execution warrant one final time before filing it among hundreds of others. His quill scratched across parchment, recording the death for the hold's official ledger. Every decision, every judgment, every drop of blood spilled in Haafingar's name passed through his hands first. The Jarl commanded, but the steward administered. Without him, Elisif's authority would crumble into chaos. He controlled property sales, mediated disputes between merchants, collected reports from village elders, and tonight, as he did every night, he would brief the Jarl on matters too tedious for court but too important to ignore. 3 holds away, in the freezing winds of Winterhold, Jarl Corir sat in his pathetic excuse for a throne room and seethed. The Great Collapse had reduced his city to rubble decades before his birth, yet the shame clung to him like ice. He possessed all the traditional powers of a Jarl: taxation rights, military command, judicial authority, but what use were these when his hold consisted of a handful of frozen buildings and a college that mocked his existence? Still, when a merchant arrived from Morrowind carrying contraband skooma, Corir exercised his right without hesitation. The merchant's screams echoed from the Jarl's personal dungeon for 2 days before Corir authorized his panoply. Release: 50 lashes. Confiscation of all goods. A fine of 500 septims. The merchant would remember Winterhold's law, even if no one else in Skyrim cared about this frozen graveyard. In Markarth, a different kind of authority festered. Jarl Igmund sat in Understone Keep, while Maven Blackbriar's letter burned in the brazier before him. She had written with characteristic arrogance, reminding him that despite his title, the Silver Blood family controlled the mines, the smelters, the very economy of his hold. Igmund's hands trembled. He commanded the city guard. He appointed thanes. He regulated trade through official tariffs. Yet when the Silver Bloods raised prices on their silver, what could he do? His taxation authority meant nothing if the mines simply produced less. His military command was meaningless when half his guards owed secret loyalty to Thonar's Silver Blood. The Jarl's power, absolute in theory, shattered against the reality of coin and corruption. Housecarl Irilith crossed the Great Hall of Dragon's Reach, with her hand never far from her blade. She served Jarl Balgruf the Greater, not out of obligation, but out of respect for one of the few Jarls in Skyrim who wielded his authority wisely. As Balgruf's personal bodyguard, she held a position of honor that transcended mere employment. Housecarls were sworn protectors, chosen for their unwavering loyalty and combat prowess. They lived in the Jarl's residence, ate at the Jarl's table, and would die defending the Jarl's life. Irilith had proven her dedication countless times, most recently when a dragon descended upon the western watchtower. While guards cowered, Irilith had stood at Balgruf's side, coordinating the defense that would save Whiterun from annihilation. But Irilith also served as Balgruf's military advisor, a role many housecarls filled beyond mere bodyguard duties. She reviewed guard rotations, assessed the city's defensive weaknesses, and when the civil war began tearing Skyrim apart, she presented Balgruf with tactical assessments of both Imperial and Stormcloak strategies. The housecarls' function varied dramatically from hold to hold. In Solitude, Bolger Bearclaw served primarily as Elisif's protector, rarely involving himself in military planning that fell to General Tullius. In Dawnstar, Jod functioned as both housecarl and captain of the guard, consolidating military authority under one trusted position. In Riften, however, no prominent housecarl existed at all, perhaps because Layla Lawgiver trusted no one enough to grant them such power. The selection process for housecarls remained shrouded in tradition and blood. They were free men and women who volunteered for service, but earning such a position required proven combat ability, unquestionable loyalty, and often years of service in a Jarl's guard forces. Some housecarls came from noble families, using the position as a stepping stone to greater power. Others were warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle. A few were former criminals who had redeemed themselves through exceptional service. Regardless of origin, all housecarls understood the fundamental bargain. Their lives belonged to their Jarl, exchanged for maintenance, glory, and a seat at the table of power. In Morthal's dank longhouse, court wizard Phalion conducted his experiments in obscurity. Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone rarely consulted him on arcane matters, preferring to trust her own visions and prophetic dreams. This suited Phalion perfectly. Court wizards occupied a peculiar position in hold governance, technically part of the Jarl's cabinet, yet largely autonomous in practice. They served as advisors on magical threats, arcane knowledge, and occasionally enchanting services, but few Jarls truly trusted magic or those who wielded it. Farengar's secret fire in Whiterun enjoyed greater influence than most, as Balgruf understood the value of arcane research. Meanwhile, in Windhelm, Woundfirth, the Unliving, faced suspicion and occasionally accusations of murder, despite his decades of loyal service to the Stormcloaks. The court wizard position came with specific privileges. They received quarters within the Jarl's residence, a stipend for reagents and research, and immunity from certain laws regarding magical experimentation. This last privilege proved darkest in its implications. Phalian's experiments with soul gems and necromantic energy would horrify most citizens of Morthal, yet, as court wizard, he operated within legal boundaries. Calcelmo in Markarth dissected Dwemer constructs and occasionally live specimens in his research into the lost race. The screams from his laboratory were protected by Jarl Igmund's authority, because court wizards answered only to their Jarl, not to the sensibilities of common folk. Interestingly, court wizards rarely changed with regime shifts during the Civil War. When Stormcloaks captured a city, they executed or exiled the Jarl, steward, and housecarl, but often retained the court wizard. Magic transcended politics. A wizard's knowledge remained valuable regardless of who sat on the throne. This practical approach revealed the position's true nature, not as political advisor, but as arcane tool, useful to whatever hand wielded power. What do you think? Should Jarls have absolute authority to pardon court wizards for crimes committed in the name of research? Where should the line be drawn between pursuing knowledge and protecting citizens? Bryling and Erikur reclined in the Blue Palace's Great Hall, their status as Thanes of Solitude evident in the fine clothes they wore and the deference other courtiers showed them. Thanes occupied a privileged tier of Nordic society, appointed by Jarls to individuals of high esteem or heroic deeds. The title came with tangible benefits: a symbolic weapon bearing the Hold's enchantments, assignment of a personal housecarl, and most valuably, the right to request that guards ignore minor crimes once per hold. The requirements for earning thanehood varied between major and minor holds, but a general pattern emerged. In major holds like Whiterun, Solitude, and Windhelm, potential thanes needed to complete a significant quest for the Jarl, assist at least 5 citizens of the hold with their problems, and crucially, purchase property within the hold's capital. This last requirement revealed the system's elitist nature. Only those with substantial wealth could achieve thane status in major cities. Property ownership was not merely symbolic. It represented a stake in the hold's prosperity, ensuring the thane's interests aligned with their jarls. Minor holds demanded less. In Falkreath, Dawnstar, and Morthal, helping 3 citizens sufficed, and property requirements were more flexible, especially with the Hearthfire land grants that allowed thanes to build homesteads on purchased plots. This regional variation reflected different administrative traditions. Eastern holds like Windhelm and Riften maintained stricter hierarchies inherited from ancient clan structures. Western holds like Falkreath operated with more egalitarian principles, where martial prowess and proven service mattered more than wealth. Thane privileges extended beyond legal immunity. They could carry weapons in the Jarl's presence, a right forbidden to common citizens. They received priority in trade disputes brought before the steward. Their testimony in court proceedings carried greater weight than an ordinary Nord's. If a thane faced accusations of serious crimes, they earned the right to trial before the Jarl personally, rather than summary judgment by guards. This last privilege had saved many a thane from execution, though it also meant Jarls bore responsibility for protecting political allies who may have genuinely committed atrocities. The service obligations of thanes remained deliberately vague in formal law, but rigid in practice. When a Jarl called, thanes answered. Balgruf summoned his thanes when dragons threatened. Elisif expected her thanes to attend court functions and provide counsel. During the Civil War, thanes faced implicit pressure to support their Jarl's chosen side, though a few managed neutrality through careful political maneuvering. The relationship between Jarl and thane mirrored older Nordic traditions of lords and sworn warriors, bonds forged not through written contract, but through honor, service, and mutual benefit. Yet thane's status could vanish as quickly as it appeared. When the Civil War resulted in a new Jarl taking power, all thanes appointed by the previous ruler lost their status. Exiled Jarls sometimes took their thanes into exile, as seen when Balgruf supporters fled to the Blue Palace after Stormcloaks conquered Whiterun. New Jarls might reappoint proven individuals as thanes, but they had no obligation to do so. This political volatility meant that during Skyrim's civil conflict, dozens of former thanes found themselves stripped of privileges, their houses confiscated, their housecarls reassigned or executed. The inheritance of the Jarl position itself followed strict succession laws. Though these varied subtly across Skyrim's 9 holds, the standard practice involved hereditary succession, with a title passing to the Jarl's firstborn child, regardless of gender. Idgrod Ravencrone's daughter, Idgrod the Younger, would inherit Morthal's jarlship despite being female, a clear demonstration of gender equality in Nordic succession law. Daughters held the same rights as sons in the line of succession, shattering any notion that Skyrim practiced male primogeniture. Dowagers, widows of deceased Jarls, could inherit the title, as evidenced by Elisif the Fair's claim to power after Ulfric Stormcloak murdered her husband, High King Torrig. Her inheritance was not merely courtesy. Nordic law recognized a deceased Jarl's spouse as legitimate successor in the absence of direct heirs. This provision prevented succession crises and maintained stability during traumatic periods like a Jarl's unexpected death. Of course, Elisif's legitimacy faced challenge not from law, but from Ulfric's claim that he had rightfully slain Torrig in single combat, invoking ancient traditions that superseded inheritance, a dispute that would drown Skyrim in blood. Succession during wartime created nightmare scenarios. The Civil War demonstrated how succession laws meant nothing when armies clashed. When Imperials captured Windhelm, Ulfric Stormcloak's claim to the jarlship vanished with his defeat, replaced by Imperial appointment of Brunwulf Free Winter. When Stormcloak seized Solitude, tradition would dictate Elisif's execution or exile, yet Ulfric made the political calculation to leave her as Jarl while neutering her power, recognizing that killing Torrig's widow might turn public opinion against him. The rules of succession, so clear in peacetime, shattered in war's crucible. If you are engaged with this account so far, hit that like and subscribe button. The Moot represented Skyrim's most distinctive governmental institution, yet it had devolved into political theater by the Fourth Era. Theoretically, when a High King died, all 9 Jarls convened in a specially called Moot to select the next ruler from among legitimate heirs or, if no heir existed, from among the Jarls themselves. The Moot's creation in the First Era had emerged from necessity after King Harald's exceptionally long reign. He died at 108 years old, outliving all but 3 of his sons, leaving succession unclear. Initially, the Moot wielded real power, arbitrating between competing claimants and ensuring stable transitions. Over centuries, partisan politics corrupted the institution. By King Borgus' reign, the Moot had become ineffective and factional. When the Wild Hunt killed Borgas in First Era 369, the Moot failed to appoint the capable Jarl Hansi of Winterhold, sparking the devastating War of Succession that lasted until First Era 420. Skyrim lost control of High Rock, Morrowind, and Cyrodiil during this conflict, territories never reclaimed. The war's conclusion produced the Pact of Chieftains, which restricted the Moot's role dramatically. Henceforth, it would convene only when a High King died without direct heirs, and it would select successors primarily from the royal family, not from any ambitious Jarl. This limited role meant the Moot had been called only 3 times in the millennia between the Pact signing and Skyrim's modern era. When it did convene, the proceedings had become formality rather than genuine deliberation. Since Solitude served as Skyrim's capital and maintained the closest ties to the Empire, the Jarl of Solitude had served as High King for generations. The Moot rubber-stamped what imperial politics had already determined. When High King Islad died and his son Torrig inherited, the Moot met to officially confirm what everyone already knew. Torrig would be High King because he was Islad's legitimate heir and because the Empire favored Solitude's continued dominance. But Ulfric Stormcloak's murder of Torrig shattered this comfortable arrangement. By ancient Nord tradition, when a High King was bested in single combat, the victor could call a Moot to choose a new ruler. Ulfric claimed this right, arguing Torrig's death proved his unworthiness to rule, and that a proper Moot should select a new High King, presumably Ulfric himself. The Empire countered that Ulfric's use of the Thuum made the duel unfair, that killing Torrig constituted murder rather than honorable combat, and that Elisif, as Torrig's widow, held legitimate claim to succession. The crisis revealed the Moot's fundamental weakness in modern Skyrim. Who decided when to convene it? What constituted legitimate grounds for calling one? Could a Moot be held during active civil war, or must peace be established first? Ulfric refused to allow a Moot while Elisif lived and held Solitude, fearing the Jarls might choose her out of imperial pressure. The Jarls themselves were divided. 4 supported Stormcloak independence, 4 backed imperial authority, and Balgruf tried maintaining neutrality. A Moot under these conditions would either result in deadlock or open combat in the meeting hall itself. Historically, the Moot met in different locations depending on circumstances. Windhelm, Skyrim's ancient capital, hosted many early Moots. In more recent centuries, Solitude's dominance meant Moots occurred in the Blue Palace. The Second Era had witnessed a split, with the Western kingdoms holding a Moot in Solitude that crowned Jarl Svarder as High King, while Eastern kingdoms held their own Moot in Windhelm crowning Princess Freydis as High Queen. Skyrim spent decades divided between rival monarchies, both claiming legitimacy through their respective Moots. Only conquest eventually reunified the province, suggesting that when political deliberation failed, swords decided succession. The Moot's voting procedures remained somewhat mysterious. Each Jarl presumably cast 1 vote, but historical records suggested that Jarls could bring supporters to speak on candidates' behalf, creating a forum for broader Nordic opinion beyond just 9 votes. The Pocket Guide mentioned that during the First Empire, Moots included representatives from each hold, implying more than just the Jarls participated. Whether minor nobles, thanes, or elected representatives joined deliberations remained unclear, lost to centuries of political evolution. By Torrig's time, Only the 9 Jarls voted, reducing the Moot to an oligarchic council rather than any form of representative governance. The crown meant nothing without the machinery to enforce it. This truth became evident as dawn broke over Riften's docks, where Steward and Uriel reviewed tax ledgers while guards dragged a fishmonger toward the cells. The merchant had failed to pay his waterfront tariff for the 3rd consecutive month. His screams about feeding his family fell on ears trained to ignore such pleas. The whole treasury demanded its due, and Anuriel served that treasury, not sentiment. Each hold maintained its own financial apparatus, independent of imperial control and often opaque to outside scrutiny. The hold treasury resided in the Jarl's longhouse or palace, physically secured by the strongest locks the Jarl could afford and metaphorically secured by the steward's iron grip on accounting. Every septim flowing through the hold's economy passed through this system: property taxes from homeowners, trade tariffs on goods crossing hold boundaries, percentages taken from mine and mill revenues, fines levied for crimes, and emergency taxation powers invoked during crisis. Property taxation followed a brutal simplicity. Citizens who owned land or structures within hold boundaries paid annual taxes calculated by property value. A modest home in Whiterun's Wind district might incur 50 septims yearly. Erikur's mansion in Solitude generated thousands. Failure to pay resulted in confiscation, with the property sold at auction to recoup lost revenue plus penalties. During harsh winters or poor harvests, dozens of families lost ancestral homes because they could not produce metal that represented abstract value the Jarl demanded. The system cared nothing for circumstance, only for the perpetual feeding of the treasury's hunger. Trade tariffs represented another revenue stream, though enforcement proved challenging across Skyrim's vast wilderness. Officially, merchants traveling between holds paid taxes when crossing borders, calculated as a percentage of cargo value. Guards stationed at major crossroads collected these fees, recording transactions in ledgers that eventually reached the steward. In practice, most traders knew which mountain passes avoided official checkpoints. Bribing a single guard cost less than paying legitimate tariffs. This created a shadow economy that hemorrhaged revenue from official coffers, yet Jarls lacked resources to patrol every game trail and forgotten road. Only the largest merchant caravans bothered with legal compliance, unable to hide their wagons from border patrols. Mines and mills generated the most reliable income, assuming the Jarl controlled them. In Markarth, the Silverblood family owned the Sidna mine and multiple smelters, making them wealthier than Jarl Igmund. They paid taxes, yes, but retained the vast majority of profits, while Igmund's treasury survived on scraps. In Riften, Maven Blackbriar controlled the meadery, the fishing industry, and the criminal underworld, rendering Layla lawgivers' authority a pathetic illusion. When Jarls directly controlled economic resources, like Whiterun's, farms, or Solitude's lumber mills, the treasury flourished. When private interests dominated, the Jarl's power withered. Emergency taxation powers existed in theory, allowing Jarls to levy additional taxes during wartime, plague, or dragon crisis. In practice, invoking such powers risked revolt. Citizens already crushed by normal taxation could not pay more without starving. Igmund discovered this when he tried doubling taxes to fund his campaign against forsworn insurgents. Instead of compliance, he received death threats and a near riot in the marketplace. He withdrew the increase within a week, learning that authority without consent merely painted targets on powerful backs. The actual administration of holds extended far beyond capital cities. Rural governance created its own nightmare of logistics and control. Most holds contained numerous small villages, farmsteads, mills, and mines scattered across dangerous wilderness. These settlements could not wait days for messages to travel to the Jarl and back. They needed local authority to resolve disputes, coordinate defense, and maintain order. Village elders filled this gap imperfectly. These were typically the oldest, wealthiest, or most respected residents of rural communities, holding informal authority through tradition rather than official appointment. When bandits threatened a village in Whiterun Hold, the village elder organized militia defense and sent word to Dragon's Reach. When farmers disputed property boundaries, the elder mediated. When a child went missing, the elder decided whether to mount a search or assume wolves had claimed another victim. This system's weakness lay in its inconsistency. Some village elders were capable administrators who maintained order and prosperity. Others were corrupt tyrants who exploited their position for personal gain, knowing the Jarl was too distant to check their power. Still others were simply incompetent, elevated to authority by age or wealth, despite lacking wisdom or leadership ability. A village might thrive under one elder and collapse under the next, entirely dependent on the lottery of local leadership. Farmsteads operated with even less oversight. Individual families owning land and working it owed taxes to the hold but otherwise governed themselves. The Jarl's authority reached them primarily through annual tax collection visits and occasional guard patrols. Between these contacts, farmsteads lived by their own rules. Domestic disputes, property disagreements with neighbors, even crimes like theft or assault were often handled without involving official justice unless severity demanded it. A farmer who beat his wife to death might face the Jarl's executioner, but one who beat her regularly without killing her likely faced no consequences beyond his neighbor's disapproval. Road maintenance represented another rural governance challenge that holds consistently failed to address. Officially, Jarls bore responsibility for maintaining roads within their territory, ensuring safe passage for merchants, travelers, and military forces. In reality, most roads outside major cities deteriorated into mud paths or rock-strewn nightmares. Bridge repairs went undone until the bridges collapsed, watchtowers crumbled, signposts rotted away, leaving travelers to navigate by memory or fortune. The hold guard structure theoretically provided security throughout each hold, but guards concentrated in cities where Jarls could see them. Rural patrols were rare, infrequent, and predictable. Bandits learned guard schedules and adjusted their activities accordingly. By the time guards arrived at a farmstead reported under attack, they typically found corpses and empty coin purses. They would file reports, the steward would note another statistic, and life continued while the next family died undefended. Guards themselves were organized into a reasonably clear hierarchy, though specifics varied between holds. At the bottom were ordinary guards, city watch who patrolled streets, manned gates, responded to crimes, and enforced the Jarl's laws. These guards wore hold-specific armor, carried standardized weapons, and received modest pay plus quarters in the barracks. Most were local recruits, men and women seeking steady employment with minimal qualifications beyond physical fitness and willingness to follow orders. Their minimum effective level was 20 in combat training, though veteran guards could match skilled adventurers. Above ordinary guards stood guard captains or commanders, officers who coordinated patrols, assigned duties, disciplined misbehaving guards, and reported directly to either the Jarl's steward or housecarl, depending on hold tradition. Commander Caius in Whiterun managed the entire hold guard under Balgruf's oversight. Captain Aldous commanded Solitude's city watch, though General Tullius controlled Hafingar's broader military operations. Some holds lacked clear guard leadership. Riften and Markarth notably had no prominent guard captain, reflecting the corruption and chaos that defined those cities. During the Civil War, hold guard forces became even more complicated. Imperial-controlled holds had their guards supplemented or replaced by legion soldiers, under legate's command. Stormcloak-controlled holds integrated their guards with Stormcloak military structures under commanders loyal to Ulfric. This created dual command chains where civilian guards answered to the Jarl, while military forces answered to Imperial or Stormcloak leadership. Conflicts inevitably emerged when guard captains and military commanders disagreed on priorities, troop deployment, or tactical decisions. Would you consider serving as a hold guard, knowing the modest pay, dangerous duties, and potential for corruption? What would it take to maintain personal honor in such a system? The justice system administered by Jarls carried the weight of life and death. When guards arrested criminals, they dragged them before the Jarl's court for judgment. For minor crimes, petty theft, trespassing, minor assault, the steward often handled proceedings, levying fines based on established bounty rates. Stealing goods worth 50 septims incurred a 25 septim fine plus confiscation. Pickpocketing earned similar penalties. Trespassing in forbidden areas resulted in warnings for first offenses and fines for repeat violations. Serious crimes demanded the Jarl's personal attention. Murder, major theft, assault causing severe injury, use of magic against civilians, transformation into vampire or werewolf form, these brought the accused before the Jarl's throne for judgment. The proceedings barely resembled trials. No advocates spoke for the accused, no jury deliberated. The Jarl heard evidence from guards, listened to witness testimony if any existed, and rendered verdict immediately. Guilt was presumed unless the accused could demonstrate innocence, an impossible task when facing a Jarl who controlled all mechanisms of proof. Punishments fell into three categories: fines, imprisonment, and execution. Fines were preferred for criminals who could pay, as they enriched the whole treasury while removing the expense of imprisonment. A merchant caught smuggling might pay thousands in fines rather than rot in cells. Wealthy criminals essentially purchased freedom through gold, while poor ones suffered harsher sentences for identical crimes. Imprisonment served as punishment for serious crimes when execution seemed excessive or when extracting labor benefited the hold. Most hold capitals maintained dungeons beneath the Jarl's residence, filthy cells where prisoners awaited trial, served sentences, or simply rotted forgotten. Sidna Mine in Markarth served as a unique prison where convicts mined silver ore to pay their debt to society and enrich the Silverblood family who owned the mine. Prisoners who survived their sentences emerged broken in body and spirit, marked by the experience in ways that ensured their permanent exclusion from decent society. Execution was reserved for the worst offenses: murder, treason, attacks on the Jarl, and occasionally crimes deemed so offensive they demanded blood. Methods varied, but beheading remained traditional across most holds. Solitude maintained a public execution block where crowds gathered to witness justice performed. The headsman's axe fell regularly in that courtyard, removing heads from necks with practiced efficiency. Smaller holds conducted executions with less ceremony: a blade in the dungeon, a body dumped outside town walls for wolves to claim. The Jarl's authority to order executions was absolute within their hold. No appeals existed. No higher court reviewed decisions. If the Jarl commanded death, death followed. This created opportunities for tyranny that many Jarls exploited. Political rivals could be arrested on fabricated charges, given sham trials, and executed before allies could intervene. Inconvenient witnesses disappeared into dungeons. Citizens who criticized the Jarl too loudly found themselves accused of treason. The justice system became a weapon wielded by those with power against those without. Bounty systems allowed Jarls to outsource enforcement. When criminals escaped hold guards, Jarls posted bounties, gold rewards, for bringing the criminal to justice, dead or alive. Adventurers and mercenaries claimed these bounties enthusiastically, hunting fugitives across Skyrim like animals. The system encouraged violence, as dead or alive meant killing was simpler than capturing. Bounty hunters had no authority to arrest, no obligation to verify guilt, and no accountability if they killed innocents. They collected gold from the steward upon presenting evidence, usually a head, and moved on to the next hunt. High-value criminals sometimes attracted bounty collectors, enforcers employed directly by Jarls to hunt down fugitives with particularly large bounties. These collectors could track criminals across hold boundaries, appearing anywhere in Skyrim to demand payment or death. Their authority derived solely from the gold backing them, but gold spoke loudly. A bounty collector from Markarth could corner a fugitive in Windhelm and demand justice, operating in legal gray areas that most guards avoided confronting. Temples and religion intersected awkwardly with hold governance. Jarls held no official religious authority, yet they maintained relationships with local temples that ranged from respectful partnership to hostile tension. Most holds hosted temples dedicated to one or more of the 9 divines, or 8, after the White Gold Concordat banned Talos worship. These temples operated semi-independently, their priests answering to religious hierarchy rather than secular authority, yet they occupied land within the Jarl's jurisdiction, and their actions affected hold stability. Jarls typically sponsored temple activities, funding festivals, providing guards for religious ceremonies, and ensuring temple properties received maintenance. This support was not altruistic. Temples provided valuable services, healing for the sick, blessings for soldiers, guidance for troubled citizens, and most importantly, legitimacy for the Jarl's rule. When a priest blessed a Jarl before assembled crowds, it signaled divine approval. When temples supported a Jarl's decisions, citizens were more likely to comply. Religion served as social control, making governance smoother when priests cooperated. But priests could also challenge Jarls. In Markarth, the Temple of Dibella operated independently of Igmund's authority, its priestesses maintaining sacred rituals the Jarl could not interfere with, even when he wanted to. In Whiterun, Heimskir's public preaching about Talos tested Balgruf's neutrality, as Imperial allies wanted the priest silenced, while Stormcloak sympathizers would riot if he was. Some Jarls appointed priests to court positions or consulted them on major decisions, creating formal integration between religious and secular authority. Shrine maintenance fell to Jarls in theory, but temples in practice. The countless wayside shrines, dotting Skyrim's roads, served travelers seeking divine blessings. Jarls were supposed to fund their upkeep, but this rarely happened. Temples sent priests or pilgrims to maintain shrines within reach, while remote shrines deteriorated until adventurers might find ancient stone markers barely recognizable as sacred spaces. Festival sponsorship created obligations Jarls struggled to meet. Major religious celebrations, like the Blessing of Arkay, required significant funding: food for feasts, wine for rituals, guards for crowd control, gifts for priests. Wealthy holds like Solitude hosted elaborate festivals that demonstrated prosperity and piety. Poor holds like Winterhold barely managed minimal observances, embarrassing everyone involved and reinforcing the hold's declining status. If this narrative has kept you listening and you want more factual accounts from the frozen north of Tamriel, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create more Elder Scrolls content. Noble house interactions created a web of alliances and rivalries that Jarls navigated carefully. Major families, Blackbriars in Riften, Silverbloods in Markarth, Shattershields in Windhelm, held power that sometimes exceeded the Jarls. These families controlled economic resources, maintained private armed forces, and possessed networks of influence spanning multiple holds. Jarls who antagonized them risked economic warfare, political sabotage, or even assassination. Inter-hold marriages solidified alliances between noble families and sometimes between Jarl families themselves. When a Silver Blood married a Battleborn, it connected Markarth and Whiterun through kinship bonds that outlasted individual Jarls. These marriages came with expectations: mutual military support during conflict, favorable trade agreements, shared intelligence about threats, and political backing in moot situations. Breaking marriage alliances was possible but carried heavy consequences, as it signaled untrustworthiness that other holds would remember. Trade agreements between holds were negotiated by stewards but approved by Jarls, creating formal economic relationships. Whiterun's grain-fed Windhelm during harsh winters, Solitude's lumber-built ships in Riften, Markarth's silver bought goods from across Skyrim. These agreements specified quantities, prices, tariff exemptions, and dispute resolution mechanisms. When holds entered conflict, trade agreements shattered, creating economic chaos as supplies stopped flowing. The Civil War proved how dependent holds were on each other. Stormcloak-controlled Windhelm suffered food shortages when Imperial-controlled Whiterun cut off grain shipments. Border disputes arose constantly between holds, usually over resource-rich territory that both sides claimed. A forest thick with valuable lumber might sit near the boundary between Falkreath and Whiterun, each Jarl insisting it fell within their jurisdiction. Iron deposits discovered on what might be Rift or Eastmarch land sparked conflicts that escalated from legal arguments to armed skirmishes. Traditional resolution involved Jarls meeting personally or sending stewards to negotiate boundaries, referencing ancient maps, historical precedent, and witness testimony. When negotiation failed, stronger holds simply seized disputed territory and dared weaker ones to take it back by force. Traditional feuds between noble houses created permanent instability. In Whiterun, the Battle-born and Greymane families maintained generations-old hostility based on ancient grievances no one quite remembered but everyone honored. These feuds erupted into violence when circumstances aligned, with guards struggling to maintain peace between families who technically broke no laws by simply hating each other. Jarls walked carefully around such feuds, as taking sides meant alienating powerful families and potentially triggering broader conflicts. Emergency powers granted Jarls extraordinary authority during crisis, though the legal framework defining emergency remained deliberately vague. Dragon attacks clearly qualified. When Alduin returned, Jarls could conscript civilians into militia forces, confiscate property for defensive construction, impose martial law restricting movement, and execute deserters without trial. Plague response fell under emergency powers, allowing Jarls to quarantine entire districts, burn infected homes, and expel potentially diseased individuals into wilderness to die alone. The Civil War itself represented the ultimate emergency, one that divided Jarls rather than unified them. Stormcloak Jarls invoked emergency powers to conscript young men into rebellion, confiscate Imperial sympathizers' property, and execute traitors who refused to support Ulfric. Imperial Jarls did likewise, hanging suspected Stormcloak agents and seizing assets to fund the Legion's operations. Both sides claimed legal authority for actions that in peacetime would be recognized as tyranny, murder, and theft. Emergency powers revealed how thin the veneer of lawful governance truly was. When crisis struck, Jarls became warlords whose authority derived from violence rather than tradition. When the horn sounded across Whiterun Hold, every able-bodied man between 16 and 50 knew what it meant: militia mobilization. Jarl Balgruf had invoked his ancient right to conscript citizens into military service, transforming farmers into soldiers overnight. They reported to the guard barracks carrying whatever weapons they owned: scythes, wood-cutting axes, rusty swords inherited from grandfathers. Commander Caius surveyed the ragged assembly with barely concealed despair. These were not warriors. They were terrified civilians who would die in their first real battle. Yet Nordic law granted Jarls absolute authority to raise militia forces during emergencies. Every citizen owed military service to their hold, a debt inherited from the ancient clan system where survival demanded that every warrior defend their people. In practice, this meant that during wartime, plague, or dragon crisis, Jarls could forcibly conscript any citizen into service. Refusal constituted treason, punishable by execution or permanent exile. The militia system transformed holds into military states overnight, sacrificing individual freedom on the altar of collective security. Militia mobilization protocols varied between holds based on population, military tradition, and immediate threat. Whiterun, positioned at Skyrim's strategic heart, maintained detailed plans for rapid mobilization. Guard captains kept lists of every able-bodied citizen, noting their combat experience, weapon proficiency, and physical condition. When mobilization orders came, guards went door to door, dragging conscripts from homes and shops. Those who fled were hunted down and brought back in chains, made examples of to discourage further desertion. Training for militia forces was minimal to non-existent. Guards showed conscripts which end of the sword to hold, taught basic formations, and prayed to the divines. Most militia members had never killed anything larger than a chicken. Their first experience with violence would be facing Stormcloak veterans or Legion soldiers, professionals who slaughtered farmers like wolves among sheep. Casualty rates for militia forces averaged 70% in major battles, numbers that Jarls accepted as the price of defending their holds. Wartime military expansion extended beyond militia conscription. Jarls hired mercenary companies, contracted with independent warriors, and sometimes struck deals with less savory forces. When Riften faced bandits overwhelming her depleted guard forces, Jarl Layla considered hiring the Thieves Guild for defense, before Maven Blackbriar reminded her who really controlled the city. Markarth's guard doubled in size during forsworn offensives, though half these guards were silver blood mercenaries, whose loyalty served coin rather than the hold. The distinction between official military forces and private armies blurred during crisis, creating power structures that persisted long after emergencies ended. The relationship between hold guards and wartime military forces created command chaos. Imperial legates technically outranked local guard captains in Imperial-controlled holds, yet guard captains knew local terrain and citizens, while legates brought professional military expertise. When Legate Quentin Scipius arrived in Whiterun, he and Commander Caius spent weeks negotiating authority boundaries before establishing a functional command structure. In Stormcloak holds, the situation was worse. Ulfric's commanders often dismissed local guards as insufficiently ideologically committed, creating rival forces that sometimes clashed with each other instead of fighting the enemy. Female succession rights in practice told a more complex story than simple legal equality suggested. Yes, daughters inherited equally with sons. Yes, Idgrod the Younger would become Jarl of Morthal. Yes, Elisif claimed legitimacy as Torig's widow. Yet the reality of female Jarls governing held a heavy price in Nordic society. Elisif faced constant challenges to her authority, with nobles and military commanders questioning every decision, attributing failures to feminine weakness while crediting successes to male advisors. She could not simply rule, she had to prove her right to rule daily against men who believed her presence on the throne defied natural order. Idgrod Ravencrone governed more successfully, but her power derived from genuine prophetic abilities that awed even skeptics. Citizens who dismissed her as a mad old woman eventually witnessed her predictions come true with disturbing accuracy. Her success came despite her gender, through supernatural gifts that male Jarls did not need to justify their authority. A woman without visions, without magic, without some exceptional quality beyond political skill, would struggle to maintain power in a society that preached equality but practiced skepticism. Historical succession disputes revealed patterns that illuminated Nordic governance's fundamental instability. The War of Succession following King Borgus' death in First Era 369 demonstrated what happened when the Moot failed. For 51 years, Skyrim tore itself apart as rival claimants fought for the crown. The obvious candidate, Jarl Hans of Winterhold, possessed capability and support, but not unanimous approval. Other Jarls saw opportunity in chaos. Instead of compromising, they went to war. Skyrim lost its territories in High Rock, Morrowind, and Cyrodiil. An empire shattered because 9 men could not agree on leadership. The dispute between Freydis and Svart in Second Era 431 split Skyrim into East and West kingdoms, each with its own High King or Queen, each claiming sole legitimacy. Freydis ruled from Windhelm, drawing support from traditional Eastern holds that valued ancient bloodlines. Svart ruled from Solitude, backed by Western holds with imperial connections and progressive politics. For over a century, Skyrim existed as 2 separate nations, united only by shared language and culture. Reunification eventually came through conquest rather than reconciliation, when one kingdom militarily absorbed the other and imposed unity through force. These historical precedents haunted the Fourth Era civil war. Ulfric and Elisif's competing claims echoed Freydis and Svartar. Would Skyrim divide again into East and West? Would another generation of Nords slaughter each other while foreign powers, the Aldmeri Dominion this time, waited to devour the pieces? The machinery of Jarl governance that worked adequately during peace revealed its fatal flaws during succession crisis. Without consensus on legitimate authority, the entire system collapsed into violence. Regional variations in hold governance reflected Skyrim's diverse cultural landscape. Eastern holds, Eastmarch, the Rift, Winterhold, maintained stricter hierarchies inherited from ancient Nordic traditions. These holds followed primogeniture succession religiously, respected ancient clan structures, and valued martial prowess above all. Their Jarls ruled with iron authority, expecting absolute obedience from subjects who saw themselves as warriors first and citizens second. Western holds, Haafingar, the Reach, Falkreath, absorbed imperial influence more readily, creating hybrid governance systems. These holds elected some officials rather than appointing them purely by birth or combat achievement. They maintained more egalitarian court structures where merchants and scholars held influence alongside warriors. Their justice systems incorporated written law codes rather than relying solely on Jarl discretion. This east-west divide created fundamental disagreements about what Nordic governance should be: traditional warrior rule or progressive adaptation. The Pale and Hjalmarch occupied a middle position, neither fully traditional nor fully progressive. These holds maintained old customs, but lacked the population and resources to resist imperial influence completely. Their Jarls governed with diminished authority compared to major holds, making compromises that stronger Jarls would refuse. This weakness made them kingmakers during succession disputes, as their votes in moots were more easily purchased through promises or threats. If you were a Jarl facing succession crisis, would you compromise to maintain peace, or fight for what you believed was rightful authority, even knowing it might destroy Skyrim? At what point does principle become destructive stubbornness? The limits of Jarl authority remained theoretically clear but practically ambiguous. Jarls could not override the High King's commands, or should not, though Ulfric certainly did. They could not levy troops beyond their hold's boundaries without permission. They could not execute citizens of other holds without extradition agreements. They could not interfere with College of Winterhold affairs due to ancient treaties granting the college autonomy. They could not suppress religion entirely, though Talos worship prohibition tested this limit. In practice, strong Jarls ignored these limits constantly. Igmund executed forsworn fighters, regardless of which hold they originated from, claiming self-defense justified overreach. Maven Blackbriar, once she became Jarl of Riften, used her position to settle scores across Skyrim, sending thugs to intimidate enemies in distant holds. The only real limit was power. Jarls could do whatever they could enforce, and consequences only mattered if someone strong enough to impose them objected. The relationship between Jarls and the High King represented Nordic governance's greatest contradiction. Jarls swore fealty to the High King, acknowledging his supreme authority over all Skyrim. Yet Jarls ruled their holds largely independently, with the High King rarely interfering in local governance. This arrangement worked when High Kings were strong and Jarls were content. It shattered when either condition failed. Toryg's reign illustrated the problem. He was High King, yes, but he was also Jarl of Solitude, meaning his direct authority extended fully only over Haafingar. Other Jarls acknowledged his supremacy, but governed their own holds as they saw fit. Toryg could not order Ulfric to ban Talos worship in Eastmarch. He could not force Layla to clean up Riften's corruption. He could ask, could request, could suggest, but actual enforcement required either the Jarls' cooperation or Imperial Legion intervention, which undermined the High King's authority by revealing it as hollow without foreign military support. When Ulfric killed Toryg, he exposed this contradiction brutally. If the High King was supreme ruler of Skyrim, how could a Jarl challenge and kill him? If Jarls truly swore binding fealty, Ulfric's challenge constituted treason, deserving immediate execution. But ancient Nordic tradition held that leadership must be proven through combat, that a High King who could not defend himself in single combat was not worthy of the crown. These two principles, hierarchical authority and martial meritocracy, could not coexist. One had to break. The Civil War forced every Jarl to choose: support the Empire and acknowledge that High Kings ruled through imperial backing rather than Nordic tradition, or support Ulfric and acknowledge that power came from strength, that any Jarl could challenge the High King if they were strong enough to kill him. Both choices destroyed something fundamental about Nordic governance. There was no right answer, only two paths toward different forms of ruin. As war consumed Skyrim, the administrative machinery of hold governance began failing systematically. Tax collection became impossible in contested territories. Village elders fled or were killed, leaving rural communities without even informal leadership. Roads collapsed completely. As maintenance ceased entirely, bandits multiplied, realizing guards were too busy fighting the war to patrol trade routes. Farmsteads burned, their owners conscripted or killed, leaving crops to rot unharvested. Winterhold watched this collapse with grim satisfaction. They had been living with governmental failure for generations since the Great Collapse. Now the rest of Skyrim experienced what Courier's Hold had endured: the slow death of infrastructure, the fading of authority, the return to primitive survival. The College of Winterhold continued its research, indifferent to the political chaos around it, demonstrating that magical institutions outlasted temporal powers. The stewards tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order. Falk, Firebeard, and Solitude worked 18-hour days processing execution orders, conscription lists, supply requisitions, and casualty reports. Anuriel and Riften juggled Maven's criminal enterprises with official duties while watching the Hold's treasury drain toward zero. Proventus Avenici served Balgruf in Whiterun until Stormcloaks captured the city, then went into exile, replaced by Brill, who discovered that steward paperwork was identical regardless of which army controlled the gates. Court wizards proved themselves the most adaptable officials. Farengar Secret Fire served Balgruf, then served Vigner Greymane after Stormcloaks installed him as Jarl, then would have served Balgruf again if Imperials recaptured Whiterun. Magic cared nothing for politics. Whoever ruled needed arcane expertise, and wizards provided it to whoever paid. This pragmatism horrified ideologues on both sides, who viewed such flexibility as betrayal. Wizards viewed it as survival. They would still be researching magic long after the current rulers were dead. Housecarls faced impossible choices. They had sworn oaths to protect their Jarls with their lives. When the Civil War changed Jarls, what happened to those oaths? Irilith followed Balgruf into exile, honoring her oath even though it meant abandoning Whiterun. Other housecarls switched allegiance to new Jarls, reasoning that their oath was to the position rather than the individual. Still others died defending Jarls, who were killed during city captures, fulfilling their oaths with blood. The thane system collapsed entirely. When new Jarls took power, all previous thanes lost their status. Property was confiscated. Housecarls were reassigned or executed if they had fought for the wrong side. Thanes who had served for decades found themselves stripped of everything overnight. Some went into exile with deposed Jarls. Others tried to earn thanehood again under new rulers, performing the same humiliating quests and payments as first-time petitioners. The Civil War revealed that thane status was not honor or recognition. It was a political tool that Jarls granted and revoked based on temporary convenience. The breakdown of the Moot as an institution reached its logical conclusion. No Moot could convene during active civil war. The Jarls who would compose it were killing each other. Even if they somehow agreed to meet, what would they decide? The fundamental question, who had legitimate authority to rule Skyrim, was precisely what they were fighting about. A Moot could not resolve the dispute that made the Moot impossible. The institution designed to prevent succession crises through deliberation had become completely irrelevant, replaced by armies deciding through slaughter what debates could not determine. Divine blessing protocols continued despite the chaos, revealing religion's role as political tool. Priests blessed armies before battle, invoking Talos for Stormcloaks despite imperial prohibition, calling upon Akatosh for Imperials. Both sides claimed divine favor. Both sides insisted the gods supported their cause. Jarls paraded priests before troops to boost morale, paying for blessings like they would pay for better weapons. The divines remained silent, offering no clear sign of preference, allowing mortals to project their desires onto celestial indifference. When battles ended, the aftermath proved even more devastating than combat. Winning sides installed new Jarls, new stewards, new housecarls, loyalists who would govern according to the victor's ideology. These sudden regime changes meant citizens who had served previous governments faced persecution. Guards who had enforced imperial law under Elisif were executed when Stormcloaks took Solitude. Merchants who had paid Stormcloak taxes in Windhelm were branded traitors when Imperials captured it. The machinery of governance that had barely functioned under single regimes shattered completely under constant regime change. Some holds changed hands multiple times during the war. Each transition meant executions, confiscations, and chaos. Citizens stopped cooperating with authority entirely, reasoning that compliance meant death when the next army arrived. Tax collection ceased because no one would admit to owning property worth taxing. Justice system collapsed because citizens trusted neither imperial nor stormcloak courts. The holds began reverting to primitive clan structures, where might made right and survival depended on personal strength rather than governmental protection. The true horror emerged in the war's final stages. Whichever side won would impose unity through conquest rather than consensus. Defeated Jarls would die or face permanent exile. Their supporters would be purged. The victor would claim legitimacy not through the traditional moot process, but through military triumph. This meant that Nordic governance, as it had existed for millennia, however flawed, would end, replaced by naked authoritarianism, where power derived solely from the sword. And in the frozen ruins of Winterhold, Jarl Courier watched Skyrim devour itself and laughed. His hold had already experienced governmental collapse. He had already learned to rule over nothing. The Great Collapse had been their apocalypse. Now the rest of Skyrim finally understood what Winterhold had known for a century, that Jarl authority, hold governance, taxation, justice, military organization, all of it was illusion. Comfortable fiction that persisted only until crisis revealed the truth. Power was violence, order was fear, governance was just another word for organized coercion. The machinery had always been tyranny, wearing tradition's mask. As dragons darkened Skyrim's skies and civil war reduced holds to battlefields, the ancient system of Jarl governance proved incapable of adaptation. It could administer peace adequately. It could extract taxes efficiently. It could maintain the illusion of justice and order, but it could not survive genuine crisis, because it was built on contradictions that prosperity concealed and disaster exposed. The chain of authority from High King to Jarl to steward to guard to citizen was only as strong as everyone's willingness to pretend it existed. Once enough people stopped believing, the chains shattered, leaving nothing but ruins and the strong preying on the weak in Skyrim's endless winter.